Well, hello and welcome. I'm Michael McCoy, and during the writing of my latest book, Dream Gardens, about a TV show I've made over the last few years, I interviewed 11 designers of the 12 gardens encapsulated in this book. One of those interviews was of the designer Fiona Brockhoff, whose work I just love, working with this fantastic mix of Australian natives and exotics. And it just so happens that Fiona's first book has just come out this year called With Nature. And it's a really fabulous book looking at her works and her philosophy, her thinking about design. So this is the interview that I did with Fiona in order to transcribe, partially at least, for the book. This is the full interview that you're about to enjoy. Unfortunately, for some glitch, there was some glitch in Zoom at the time, or my settings or whatever, that meant that I only recorded Fiona's face and not mine at all. So it's Fiona on her own, with just this voiceover coming over from me every now and again. But it was a really fantastic discussion, as it always is with Fiona. She has such an individual approach to design, and her gardens are consequently unique. So I know that you're really going to enjoy this. There's some really lovely moments in there of her talking about some of the challenges of the particular job that we were looking at together for the TV show, but also some really lovely memories of her early experiences in gardens and gardening and what that did to make her love certain plants. So sit back and enjoy this interview with Fiona Brockhoff and keep an eye out for her book.
Hi.
Hey, Fiona.
I've just got to deliver something to the COVID patients.
Go and do that.
Just putting my nurse's hat on. Won't be a minute.
It does seem to me that this site was, at least from a point of view of visual cues, relatively benign or neutral compared to a lot of your other coastal sites. Is that safe to say?
I think it's very safe to say that the beauty of the existing vegetation was that not all of it was on that property, but actually around it. And it gave the house a really beautiful backdrop because we had Norfolk Island pines, we had willows, and we had a cypress next door. So we had all of this lovely sort of greenery, and then the house just sat very nicely in front of that, looking to the north, and it gave us this really lovely big open stage to give Sam and Jim exactly what they wanted. And also a beautiful sense of arrival because we drive down that lovely long driveway with the cypress trees, and then you come through a hole of vegetation and there is the property that opens up in front of you. So the site we didn't have a lot of existing vegetation that we had to respect, but we had some good existing vegetation within the garden proper that I think has been really useful and has given the garden a sense of age before it's actually become of age. So we had Melaleuca armillaris, 2 beautiful specimens, which we thinned up. I guess we sculpted and then we canopy thinned to let light down onto some of the new planting. And we had a really beautiful old Leptospermum labigatum down past the pool, which had the same treatment. So we had a little bit of existing vegetation within the garden, and that was really helpful because there was some bones to work around, but it didn't limit what we designed and built. So I think that I had to make it feel more coastal to particularly address Jim's brief. Jim wanted something that reminded him of his days on the Portsea back beach, walking through the sand dunes with a surfboard under his arm, maybe reminded him of his youth, and it needed to feel very coastal. And Sam wanted a retreat from the outside world. She wanted somewhere where she could go, which would be, I guess, have a resort feel. So it was very green, it was lush, it was private, and it was enclosed. So I think that part was probably easier to achieve because it's a very sheltered site. So it's easier to choose some plants with larger leaves and know they're not going to get ripped by the wind, like Tetrapanax papyrifera, like flaxes and cannas and things like that. Jim wanted that more sort of like blonde grass, you know, blowing in the wind, like Ostrostepus topoides type of thing, and correas that had been wind shaped. And as you know, it was a matter of balancing both of those briefs and creating something that was cohesive, that actually was functional, i.e. it would work in the site, and they were both happy, you know. So bringing the big pier beams in, those pylons, was part of giving it a more coastal feel, to say we're actually near the beach, and we're telling you that by giving you an old pier pylon.
Right,
so
right.
you won't forget it. The other idea behind them was to bring the house architecture, or I guess structure in the garden, out to the entrance to give the house a stronger connection with the landscape. And so and it told you that you were arriving somewhere, and it was identifying the arrival zone with these sort of sentinels, if you like. So I felt like I had to make it more coastal for Jim in a way, and cement its sort of sense of place with those pylons. And I think they do that really well. And the other part of it is, I guess, the planting style and the actual plants, and particularly the colours of the foliage and the habits of those plants.
Yes, it's something that it seems to me very strongly, certainly within your coastal work, is it feels like your second language is working with these plants and working so beautifully with those plants, but within what seems to be a really desaturated or really limited colour range.
So I think you can, you know, I was saying to someone the other day, there's the plants that will work on a site without lots of sort of support in terms of, you know, irrigation, nutrition. And then there's the way that you use those plants, and you can make a garden feel quite Japanese using those plants, because it's about giving maybe more space between plants, and then how you treat them. So you might cloud prune a tea tree or a bearded heath into something that feels really quite Japanese. And then you might have some very simply pruned sort of spheres of sea box or a correa. And then you might have something sort of strappy and some beautiful limestone rocks. And then you can use all of those plants again in a completely different way and make it feel very sort of busy and sort of overwhelming in a way, with sort of texture and movement and leaf color and variation. It's just about how you place those or position those plants in the landscape, and then how you treat them. So people say, I really want to have a sort of a cottage feel. Well, they mightn't really mean that they want cottage plants, but they might want it to feel like there's a lot of sort of seasonal color variation. And so you can then, I think, still not perfectly achieve that, but you can achieve that sort of look by saying, okay, we're going to use, you know, Verbena bonariensis. We know that it thrives without lots of sort of care, and we're going to combine it with a kangaroo paw or a succulent that will flower in winter, and we're going to give some, I don't know, balls of teucrium to hold it, and then there'll be limonium and phlomis and all of these sort of Mediterranean plants that we know will succeed in the climate and the given circumstances, but we're going to use them in a way that gives someone the sort of cottage feel that they connect to. So you could use all of those plants in a different way as well, and create something completely different.
Yeah, it feels to me like, I mean, it's now 30 years since we had a conference in Melbourne about, it was run by Melbourne Water. It was the follow-up to that original garden conference in 1989, but in 1992, there was a conference then about xeriscaping. but it feels to me like there's been 30 years of talk about plants to use that cope with our climate and cope with the changing climate, but not enough talk about how to use those plants together, how to create the look or the community of planting or whatever, that how to use those plants is at least as important as the plants that the decision about the plants that you're using, isn't it?
That's right. I think so. So people sort of go, oh, we're going to have a cactus garden, and they go, because that's xeriscaping, we're never going to have to water it, and we'll just put a whole lot of different cactuses in like they do. I went to Palm Springs 2 years ago. That's what happens. Instead of going, okay, well, we want it to feel calm and relaxing, so we don't want it to feel too busy. What are the 6 different cactuses we're going to use? Which are going to be the features? Which are going to be the ground covers? Which are going to be the supporting characters and the main characters, and how are we going to actually place them to create privacy, interest, whatever it is, rather than going, there's only one type of cactus garden and that's the lolly shop cactus garden, or there's only one type of Japanese garden and that's the Japanese garden that has Japanese plants in it.
In your fantastic example then about cactus gardens, it clearly for you to minimize diversity or to limit diversity seems to be a strong way of achieving the kind of unity that is inherent in your gardens. Is that safe to say?
It's always a fine line between diversity and, I guess, limiting the species, because if you repeat something too often, people go, sick of looking at that grey plant. You've got it everywhere. So it's such a fine balance, isn't it? I design a planting scheme and then I try and walk around it and look at it from, if you were down in that area looking back, what would it look like? If you were upstairs looking down on it, what would it look like? And so garden design is difficult from that point of view, because you've got to keep walking around the garden and trying to imagine what you're going to see. Is it balanced? Is there enough diversity? Have I got enough height to hide the neighbours? Have I got enough interest from the main living area? And so I think it can depend though on the foliage habit and the foliage texture or colour. So you could have a lot of diversity if you were just going to use grey plants, because it doesn't feel like as much diversity if you're just using hirsute plants.
Yeah, it really feels to me like unity can cross across the line into monotony.
Yeah.
And diversity can cross a line into cacophony.
Yeah.
And what
right.
you need is something in the middle that holds both of those things,
well said. And, I think there's generally the risk is that there's too much diversity and not enough monotony. And I always go through planting plans going, which plant could we live without? Will it fall apart if we take this out? Will it fall apart if we take that out? And if we replace that, would that give it just a little bit more diversity, but not too much? And garden design's easy until it gets to the planting, and then you go, okay, we've got to think really carefully about this. What are the plants that will survive? What are the plants that are going to look the best, and fulfill the brief? And how are we going to arrange them?
I know. It's nearly always a pragmatic. Your final list is nearly always a very, very pragmatized list of, it's almost never the ideal stuff, is it? It's just what's available, is going to grow there, and what of those things together can turn into something magical.
That's right. And I think that's why sometimes if the palette is limited, and it can be very limited if you're gardening on top of a limestone cliff on Kangaroo Island, and you've got very little water for irrigation, you've got very little soil, you've got heat and wind, you're going, okay, well, we're stuck with really this very sort of limited palette of plants. So how are we going to use them to make this garden unique and special and engaging? So, let's take the she oak and prune it into a lollipop. you know, and so you've got to really think hard about how you're going to use those plants, or how you're going to place them, and then treat them. Then you've got to know what those plants are capable of. And I think that's why I love bushwalking so much. And particularly if you bushwalk in an area where, you know, the spotted gum originates from, or she oaks originate, you get to really know their characteristics and how they grow, or how they're capable of growing in the wild. And then you can take that information back to a horticultural situation and go, I know that sea box loves to be pruned by wind, because I see it all over the New South Wales cliffs. Here it's a bit different, but I know that I can take that into my garden and shear it and shear it and shear it, and it loves it, and it looks green and beautiful, and you know, you use that as an anchor in that garden space. So having that understanding, even if you can't visit a site firsthand, but to read about where a plant comes from, and to understand where it exists in the understory of other planting, or you know, how it protects other plants, or how it needs protecting, is really useful.
During the filming of the show, you and I did an interview, only a small amount of which went in the show, but there was this lovely moment in that interview where I was talking to you about the inherent modesty of your plant palette in your coastal gardens, and you hilariously said, "Oh no, sometimes I like using, you know, really flamboyant things like a flax." And I lauged at the time. I was going, only Fiona Brockhoff would describe flax as flamboyant.
I'm going to remember to call them flamboyant flaxes from now on. I think, you know, one of my oldest memory of the flax is that I used to wait for the postman each day, you know, as a kid. That was just so exciting. The milkman who I used to ride with, and then the postman about mid-morning. And I used to sit in this big variegated flax, and I'd wait for the postie each day. And Mum was probably keeping an eye on me. And in the meantime, I used to get that flax, and I used to rip it, you know, into tiny things. And then I used to twirl it around things and tie it around things. And so I've just, you know, flax has just been such a big part of my life for so long. I don't think I could live without them. And people go, like Paul Bang, go, I just don't understand why. That's the one thing I don't understand about you, how you can actually use a service station plant like flax, and you use it everywhere and all the time. And I was thinking yesterday, actually, does anyone else plant flax? Because you can't get them. The reason I get them is that I salvage them from other people's gardens. Jeremy goes with David's big truck. They fill up the truck with flax, and they bring them back, and we put them into 100-litre pots and 50-litre pots, and they all live down in the orchard until they're ready to go into a garden. But I was thinking yesterday, I don't think anyone else uses this. And then I felt quite good about that, actually.
Yeah. The keeper of the keys. One day we'll all rediscover them.
Maybe. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, maybe you have to go to the west coast of the South Island of New Zealand.
Oh man, I know.
And see the majesty of that landscape with those flax, with those flowers, and the cordyline and all of those other beautiful New Zealand plants, just to go, that is one of the most beautiful wild landscapes I've ever seen. Oh. Maybe you need to have that experience to come home and go, I love flax.
Well, my point was not at all about whether flax was worthy, as much as just how incredibly within an environment, within a plant palette that is so inherently modest, how you can take a plant like flax and use it in a way as to amplify its flamboyance.
Yeah. And I think that's right. I mean, to me, it's a feature plant. It's not a supporting character. If you've got a flax, you know, it moves, particularly in winter when the sun's low, the light bounces off the leaves in the most beautiful way. And then it throws up these big flowers, and all the honey eaters come in, and, you know, you've got this lovely sort of food source for them. And, you know, for me, it gives you so much, but it's not a supporting character. It's definitely a main character, or a main stage sort of character. And I think, I don't know, it's with a coastal garden, particularly when a lot of the local plants have very small leaves, and they're often a grey-green colour, and that's an evolutionary thing. You know, that's how they survive in a windy climate like this. Having larger leafed plants really adds something to the palette, and I guess for me that's, you know, it's flax and it's cordylines too, that can, you know, just add something else.
Just back to Portsea for a bit. I'm really interested in the layout of that garden, that when you have an L-shaped house like that, the temptation for nearly every home designer designing their own garden would be to have plonked the pool in that alcove created by the L shape. And you decided to push that right away from the house.
That's right. And there was a number of reasons that we did that. When you put a pool very close to a house in that sort of situation, you've got to think very carefully about how the pool fencing will work and how that can potentially interfere with views out of the house into the rest of the garden. I said to Sam and Jim, I think if they put the pool in that area, there would be obvious issues with the pool fencing and openings with from the house to the exterior areas, but also it almost cut them off from the rest of the garden. By the time we gave them a pool sitting area within the pool enclosure, suddenly you've got a big sort of fenced in area, even if the pool fence is beautiful, that comes between you and your connection with the rest of the garden. The other thing was the pool in that spot was never going to get afternoon sun, and most people love to use their pools in the afternoon, and you know, and also just to have lovely space around it, so you can sit around that pool and look into different areas of the garden. You felt very sort of boxed into a corner or pushed into a corner in that location. So I said to them that I thought it should go further out, because pools in Australia are also probably only used for 3 or 4 months of the year, unless they're heated with expensive to buy resources. And if the pool is further out, it can be a sort of a go-to place where you go out there maybe with a tray of drinks and you have an hour or half an hour or whatever it is. It's not so far away that you can't come back and get a glass of water or, you know, some more drinks or a plate of watermelon. And therefore, they could use that area for 3 or 4 months of the year, but it didn't dominate the entire space for 12 months of the year. And I think, you know, one of the things Sam says now is, thank goodness you talked us out of that position. And I said, well, I don't think you were ever tied to it. You just hadn't really explored the other things that you could do with that pool. And just touching on why it's elevated. It's a very flat site, and I thought actually putting the pool down at sort of ground level, even with planting around it, didn't seem to be that interesting. It was good to sort of bring it up out of the landscape. It increases the usability of it, in that, you know, you just get that little bit more sun for a little bit longer, particularly if you're in a low-lying sort of site with, you know, potential shade in the afternoon from all the cypresses to their northwest and west and southwest. But also, what we found out subsequently is there's an issue with the water table there. It's very high, and one of our pool contractor had in fact built a pool on the other side of the lagoon, which had popped out of the ground before it had water in it. It was pushed up by the water table. So we also had that to contend with. And so we spoke to Chris a lot about how high he thought it should actually be out of the ground, to avoid repeating that sort of scenario. So it was good that we were thinking already of having it sort of on this lovely sort of timber platform and sitting proud of the landscape. But it actually, from a functional point of view, it was actually necessary, and we probably would have had to have done that anyway. But, you know, luckily with that site, there's a lot of room to give everything the space it needs to be, I guess, have its own sort of character and planting in a way. And I think with time, once the trees grow, and already you'd be surprised, the Eugonus and the Banksias have really come up, and the scale starts to feel a whole lot better. Whereas I think for me before, it felt like quite a big lawn flanked by slightly disproportionate planting. And now that that planting's developed, it's really, I guess, it holds the house strongly in the landscape and connects the house strongly to the landscape. And it's made the lawn feel smaller and more in scale.
Don't you love Fiona? And I really enjoy her really fantastically unpretentious way of thinking about gardens and of creating them. So just look out for her book, With Nature, which has been out in the shops now for 6 months or so. And then on the 30th of this month, which is November 2022, my book is coming out. So look out for that as well, called Dream Gardens, named the same as the TV show was, and looking at 12 of the gardens featured in that show, and really thinking through the design strengths of each of those gardens, and also in each chapter taking a design principle that garden particularly exemplifies and really expanding on that. So look out for that as well. But thanks for joining us today.